Welcome, dear friend, to another peaceful journey through the shadowed corridors of history. It's truly wonderful to have you join me tonight as we venture into a world far removed from our modern comforts and conveniences. I hope this tale can serve as a gentle companion as you settle into rest, letting your mind wander to distant times and forgotten places. Before we begin our exploration, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from right now and what the weather is like outside your window. Are you bundled up against winter's chill or perhaps enjoying a warm evening breeze? Please feel free to leave a comment and let me know how far these stories of endurance and faith have travelled to reach you. And if you find yourself drawn to these quiet explorations of history's hidden truths, please consider subscribing for more restful voyages into the past. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now make yourself as comfortable as possible, take a slow, deep breath, and prepare to let your imagination carry you back nearly 1,000 years, to a time when winter wasn't just an inconvenience to be overcome with central heating and insulated walls, but a merciless adversary that tested the very limits of human survival. When most people think of medieval monks, they picture serene figures in brown robes, quietly copying manuscripts in candlelit chambers, tending peaceful gardens, and living lives of contemplative prayer removed from the harsh realities of the outside world. And while there's certainly truth to this image of scholarly devotion and spiritual dedication, it represents only a small glimpse into a far more harrowing and complex reality. You see, for medieval monks, surviving the brutal winter months wasn't a matter of simply lighting a few extra candles and putting on warmer clothing. It was a desperate, months-long battle against starvation, hypothermia, disease, and death itself that claimed the lives of countless religious brothers who had devoted themselves to serving God in some of the most remote and unforgiving locations imaginable. From the moment the first autumn leaves began to fall, these men of faith faced a relentless countdown to what many called the dying time. Those merciless months when howling winds would transform their stone monasteries into frozen tombs, when food stores would dwindle to nothing, when the weak and elderly would simply not wake up from their prayers, their bodies finally succumbing to the cold that seeped through every crack and crevice of their austere dwellings. This was a world where frostbite was as common as communion wine, where monks would huddle together for warmth like animals, and where the sound of morning bells often went unanswered because brothers had died silently in their cells during the night. But these remarkable men didn't merely endure these impossible conditions. In many ways, they created an entire culture around surviving them. Through ingenious methods of food preservation, revolutionary heating techniques, and an almost superhuman capacity for suffering in silence, medieval monks developed survival strategies that would make modern wilderness experts weep with admiration. They learned to read the subtle signs of approaching winter storms in ways that rival today's meteorologists. They perfected techniques for keeping manuscripts from freezing solid and ink from turning to ice. They even developed complex social systems for sharing body heat and rationing the meagre calories that stood between them and starvation. Yet behind the inspiring tales of faith triumphing over adversity, the reality of monastic winter survival was often far more grim and desperate than any of us could imagine from our centrally heated homes. In the coming hour together, we'll pull back the veil of romantic religious imagery to uncover the true story of these extraordinary men. We'll explore the shocking methods they used to stay alive when the outside world became literally uninhabitable. We'll meet some of the most fascinating figures of the medieval church, not just the famous abbots and scholars whose names appear in history books, but also the humble kitchen brothers who kept communities fed, the infirmary monks who tended to the dying, and the brave souls who volunteered for the most dangerous winter duties that someone had to perform if anyone was to survive until spring. Along our journey, we'll grapple with some profound questions about faith, endurance, and the incredible lengths human beings will go to in pursuit of their beliefs. What drove these men to choose lives of such extreme hardship in service of the divine? How did their profound faith shape not just their spiritual practices, but their remarkably innovative approaches to survival? And what can we learn from their extraordinary resilience as we face our own modern challenges and struggles? But before we delve into these deeper mysteries, let's take a moment to set the scene. Picture, if you will, the ancient monastery of St. Aldrich, nestled high in the windswept mountains of what we might call the northern reaches some 900 years ago. It's late October, and the first killing frost has already begun to paint the monastery walls with sheets of ice that will not fully melt until May. Inside the thick stone walls, 43 monks are making their final preparations for what they know will be the ultimate test of their faith, their ingenuity, and their will to live. This is their world. A world where survival itself was an act of devotion, where every calorie consumed was carefully weighed against the lives of brothers, and where the line between life and death was as thin as the ice that would soon cover their water basins each morning. So as you sink deeper into the warmth of your bed, feeling your eyelids grow heavy with the promise of peaceful sleep, prepare to enter a realm where such comfort was an unimaginable luxury, and where simply living to see another sunrise required a kind of courage that most of us will never need to summon. Our journey begins in the depths of winter itself, in the frozen heart of a monastery where ordinary men performed extraordinary acts of survival in their unwavering service to something greater than themselves. When most of us imagine medieval monasteries during winter, we picture scenes straight out of illuminated manuscripts, robed figures, peacefully transcribing holy texts by candlelight, warming themselves by cosy hearth fires, sharing hearty meals of bread and ale in great stone halls filled with the gentle murmur of evening prayers. We envision these holy sanctuaries as havens of learning and contemplation, where scholarly monks debate theology while safely sheltered from the harsh world beyond their walls. Perhaps we imagine the soft glow of stained glass windows casting colourful patterns across snow-covered courtyards, or picture kindly old abbots dispensing wisdom and warm soup to travellers seeking refuge from winter storms. This romanticised vision isn't entirely wrong. Monasteries did indeed serve as centres of learning, and many monks did spend countless hours preserving ancient knowledge through their meticulous copying of texts. The great monasteries of medieval Europe were genuine sanctuaries of scholarship and spiritual devotion, places where the flickering flames of classical learning were kept alive through the darkest centuries of human history. These religious communities truly were islands of literacy and culture in a largely illiterate world, and their libraries contained treasures of knowledge that would otherwise have been lost forever. But here's what those romantic images don't show you. The monk crouched over his manuscript wasn't warmed by a cosy fire. He was desperately trying to prevent his ink from freezing solid in the bitter cold air, his fingers so numb with cold that he could barely grip his quill. That hearty meal in the great hall? It was more likely a thin gruel made from whatever mouldy grain could be stretched to feed the community for one more day, consumed in a draughty stone chamber where your breath formed clouds with every exhale. Those stained glass windows, they provided no real barrier against the howling winter winds that could drop temperatures inside the monastery to levels that would kill the weak and elderly within hours. The truth is that medieval monasteries weren't cosy retreats from winter's fury. They were survival outposts where death stalked the corridors as surely as it prowled the wilderness beyond their walls. These stone fortresses, built to last for centuries, became tomb-like prisons when winter arrived, trapping their inhabitants in a months-long struggle against cold, hunger and disease that would test every aspect of their faith and ingenuity. What we're about to discover together challenges everything we think we know about monastic life during the medieval period. Far from being sheltered academics living lives of comfortable contemplation, these men were some of the most resourceful and desperate survivors in human history, forced to develop survival techniques that would make modern wilderness experts pause in admiration and horror. They weren't just copying books and singing hymns. They were engaged in a daily battle for survival that required them to become part scholar, part farmer, part engineer, part doctor, and part soldier in an ongoing war against nature itself. You see, the monasteries weren't built for comfort. They were built for eternity. Those thick stone walls that seem so sturdy and protective, they turned these holy places into refrigerators once winter set in, absorbing the cold and holding it like ice houses designed to preserve food rather than human life. The soaring architectural spaces that inspire awe in summer became cavernous death traps in winter, impossible to heat and filled with air so cold it could stop a man's heart. The very features that made these monasteries magnificent also made them potentially lethal to anyone trapped inside when the snows began to fall. But perhaps the most shocking misconception of all is the idea that these monks faced winter with serene acceptance, trusting in divine providence to see them through the darkest months. The reality was far more desperate and far more human. These men of God were forced to make choices that would challenge the faith of saints, deciding which brothers would receive the last scraps of food, determining who was strong enough to survive the dangerous tasks that had to be performed in deadly conditions, and sometimes even making the ultimate decision of who would live and who would die when resources ran dangerously low. The comfortable image of medieval monasteries as peaceful winter retreats crumbles completely when we examine the historical records of what actually happened during those brutal months. We find accounts of monks eating bark and roots, of entire communities decimated by cold and starvation, of desperate measures taken to generate even the smallest amount of heat, and of survival strategies so extreme they would shock us even by today's standards. So as we begin our journey into this hidden world, prepare to set aside everything you thought you knew about medieval monastic life. The story we're about to explore isn't one of peaceful contemplation and scholarly pursuits. It's a tale of human endurance pushed to its absolute limits, of faith tested in the crucible of survival, and of ordinary men forced to become extraordinary in order to live through winter months that killed as surely as any plague or war. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The harsh reality we're about to uncover goes far beyond simple discomfort or inconvenience. What awaited medieval monks each winter was nothing short of a systematic assault on human survival that would challenge every aspect of their physical endurance, mental fortitude, and spiritual conviction. This wasn't merely a matter of putting on extra layers or lighting more candles. It was a brutal test of whether the human body and spirit could endure conditions that seemed designed to extinguish life itself. Picture Brother Aldwyn of Ravenscroft Abbey, a fictional but representative figure whose story echoes through countless monastery records from across medieval Europe. As the autumn of 1347 drew to a close, Aldwyn could feel the familiar dread settling into his bones like the cold itself. He had survived 11 winters in the remote mountain monastery of St. Cornelius, and each one had taken something from him: friends who never woke from their final sleep, fingers lost to frostbite, and a persistent cough that had never quite left his lungs since the terrible winter of 1344, when half the community perished. But Aldwyn knew that this winter would be different, and not in a good way. The harvest had failed catastrophically, leaving the monastery's food stores at barely half their usual levels. The roof of the granary had partially collapsed during an early October storm, allowing precious grain to rot and spoil. 3 of their most experienced winter survival brothers had died of fever during the autumn months, taking with them decades of accumulated knowledge about how to stretch meagre resources through the deadly months ahead. Most ominously, the local villagers who usually traded with the monastery had warned that this winter would be unlike any in living memory. The signs in nature all pointed to what the old ones called a killing winter. The brutality that Brother Aldwyn and his fellow monks faced wasn't theoretical or distant. It was immediate, personal, and absolutely merciless. When winter arrived in earnest, usually sometime in late November, it didn't announce itself with gentle snowflakes or picturesque frost. Instead, it descended like a predator, bringing howling winds that could literally knock a man off his feet, temperatures that could freeze human flesh solid within minutes of exposure, and snow that fell so heavily and relentlessly that the monastery could become completely cut off from the outside world for months at a time. The stone walls that had seemed so protective during warmer months became instruments of torture once the deep cold set in. Medieval mortar and construction techniques, while impressive for their time, were no match for the thermal dynamics of a true winter siege. The massive stone blocks that formed the monastery walls would absorb the cold like enormous sponges, creating internal temperatures that could drop well below freezing, even in the deepest interior chambers. Brothers would wake to find their water basins frozen solid, their breath visible in great white clouds, and ice forming on the inside surfaces of walls that were supposed to protect them. But the cold was only the beginning of their torment. The monastery's heating systems, such as they were, consisted primarily of a few central fireplaces and the occasional brazier filled with precious charcoal or wood. Fuel was always desperately scarce. Every piece of wood had to be gathered, chopped, and transported by hand, often in conditions that made such work incredibly dangerous. Brothers regularly suffered severe injuries while attempting to gather firewood in blizzard conditions, and more than a few monks simply disappeared into the white wilderness never to be seen again. The rationing system that governed monastery life during winter was a study in calculated desperation. Every calorie was measured, every morsel of food weighed against the survival of the community as a whole. The daily ration for a working monk during winter might consist of a small bowl of thin porridge made from whatever grain could be spared, perhaps a crust of bread so hard it had to be soaked in water to be edible, and if they were fortunate, a small piece of salted meat or fish that had been preserved since the previous autumn. This meagre diet provided perhaps half the calories a man needed to maintain his body weight and energy levels, meaning that monks would gradually waste away throughout the winter months, their bodies consuming their own muscle and fat in a desperate attempt to stay alive. The psychological toll of this constant hunger and cold was perhaps even more devastating than the physical suffering. Monks who had devoted their lives to contemplation and prayer found their thoughts consumed by fantasies of warmth and food. The spiritual disciplines that had once brought them peace and purpose became almost impossible to maintain when every moment was focused on the basic animal need to survive another hour, another day. Prayer sessions became endurance tests, where monks struggled to remain conscious in the bitter cold, and many community activities had to be abandoned entirely as brothers conserved every ounce of energy for survival. Disease flourished in these conditions like some medieval nightmare. Respiratory infections spread rapidly through communities of weakened, malnourished men living in close quarters. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and sometimes entire limbs, leaving survivors permanently disabled and even less capable of contributing to their community's survival. Dysentery from contaminated food or water could kill a man within days, while influenza or pneumonia could sweep through an entire monastery in a matter of weeks, leaving only a handful of survivors to face the remainder of winter alone. Perhaps most terrifyingly, monks faced these trials with the knowledge that rescue was impossible. Once winter had truly set in, they were completely isolated from the outside world. No help could reach them, no supplies could be delivered, and no escape was possible. They had only themselves, their faith, and whatever resources they had managed to accumulate before the snows began. The nearest village might be only a few miles away, but it might as well have been on another continent for all the assistance it could provide during the darkest months. This was the reality that awaited Brother Aldwyn and countless thousands of his fellow monks across medieval Europe every single year. It wasn't a test of faith. It was a test of whether faith could sustain human life when everything else had failed. As we prepare to explore the remarkable and often shocking ways these men learned to survive, remember that what we're about to discover represents some of the most extreme examples of human endurance and ingenuity in recorded history. Let us journey together now, through the mists of time and memory, to a place that exists somewhere between dream and history. Close your eyes, if you will, and allow your mind to drift backward through the centuries, past the age of steam and industry, past the Renaissance and its rediscovery of classical learning, past the great cathedrals and crusades, until we arrive at a moment frozen in time like the very ice that will soon define our story. It is the feast day of St. Martin, November 11th, in the year of our Lord 1203, and the first light of dawn is struggling to penetrate the thick stone walls of the monastery of St. Erasmus, perched high on a windswept plateau in the remote region known as the Thornlands. The air itself seems to hold its breath, heavy with the promise of winter's imminent arrival. Already the morning frost clings to the courtyard stones like skeletal fingers, and the wooden shutters creak ominously in a wind that carries the scent of distant snow. Within the monastery's walls, 37 monks are stirring to consciousness in their individual cells, each no larger than a modern closet and furnished with nothing more than a straw mattress, a wooden cross mounted on the wall, and a small niche carved into the stone for their few personal possessions. The sound that awakens them is not the gentle tolling of bells that marks their usual prayer times, but rather the harsh scraping of ice being chipped away from the well in the courtyard, a sound that will become as familiar as their own breathing in the months ahead. Brother Matthias, the monastery's cellarer and keeper of provisions, emerges from his cell with movements that betray the weight of responsibility he carries. At 43 years of age, he is one of the oldest monks in the community, having survived more winters in this remote outpost than any man should reasonably be expected to endure. His beard, once a rich brown, now shows streaks of premature grey that speak to the stress of managing survival for an entire community when survival itself seems impossible. As he makes his way through the corridor, his breath forms small clouds in the frigid air, and he can already feel the familiar ache in his joints that tells him this winter will be particularly brutal. The monastery's layout, which seems so logical and purposeful in the warmer months, transforms into a maze of potential death traps once winter arrives. The long corridors that connect the various buildings become wind tunnels that funnel the bitter cold with surgical precision into every corner of the complex. The beautiful arched windows that flood the scriptorium with light during summer become gaping wounds that bleed warmth from the interior spaces faster than any fire can replace it. The stone floors, polished smooth by generations of sandaled feet, become treacherous sheets of ice that can send an unwary monk tumbling to injury or death with a single misplaced step. In the scriptorium, Brother Anselm carefully examines his precious manuscripts, running his fingers along the vellum pages to check for the telltale brittleness that warns of approaching cold damage. He has already begun the laborious process of wrapping the most valuable texts in layers of wool and oiled cloth, creating protective cocoons that might preserve these irreplaceable works of scholarship through the months of freezing that lie ahead. His ink has been mixed with a special blend of wine and oil that he hopes will prevent it from freezing solid, though he knows from bitter experience that there will come nights when the cold will defeat even his most ingenious preparations. The monastery's chapel, usually the warm heart of their spiritual life, stands empty and echoing in the pre-dawn darkness. The great stone altar, which radiates such dignity and peace during their regular services, now seems like a tomb marker in the shadows. Soon, it will become one of the few places in the monastery where the community can gather for warmth, their combined body heat creating a small pocket of survivable air temperature in an otherwise lethal environment. But even there, morning prayers will become endurance tests where monks struggle to recite familiar words through chattering teeth, their fingers too numb to turn the pages of their prayer books. Down in the kitchens, Brother Felix surveys their winter stores with the practiced eye of a man who has learned to calculate survival in terms of ounces and days. The great wooden barrels that line the storage rooms contain their entire hope of living until spring. Preserved meats floating in salt brine, wheels of hard cheese sealed in wax, sacks of grain that must be rationed down to individual kernels if necessary. He runs his hands over each container, mentally calculating and recalculating, knowing that his mathematics of survival will determine who lives and who dies in the months ahead. The monastery's infirmary, tended by Brother Honorius, already shows signs of preparing for the inevitable casualties of winter. Beds have been moved closer together to conserve body heat, and stocks of what few medicinal herbs they possess have been carefully inventoried. Brother Honorius knows that his modest medical knowledge will be tested to its limits in the coming months, as he attempts to treat frostbite, malnutrition, and the various diseases that flourish when human beings are pushed to the very edge of survival. His surgical instruments, primitive by any standard, lie ready for the amputations that winter will almost certainly require. Outside, the wind is beginning to pick up, rattling the wooden doors and causing the monastery's few remaining autumn leaves to dance in frantic spirals across the courtyard. The sky has taken on that peculiar leaden quality that experienced winter survivors recognize as the herald of serious snow. In the stables, the monastery's single horse stamps nervously, as if sensing the change in the air. Soon, even this hardy beast will require constant care to survive, competing with the monks themselves for precious resources and shelter. This is the world of the medieval monastery on the eve of winter, a place where every detail of daily life is about to be transformed by the approaching season of death. The familiar rhythms of prayer, work and study that have governed these men's lives for months are about to give way to something far more primitive and desperate: the simple, overwhelming need to stay alive until spring returns. As the first snowflakes begin to fall outside the monastery walls, settling like white ash on the stones of the courtyard, we prepare to witness one of humanity's most remarkable struggles for survival, played out in a setting that will test every aspect of human ingenuity, endurance, and faith. Within the walls of St. Erasmus Monastery, we encounter a tapestry of human souls, each carrying their own burdens, skills, and secrets that will prove crucial to the community's survival in the months ahead. These are not the cardboard saints of popular imagination, but complex men with histories, fears, and motivations as varied as the winter storms that will soon test them all. Brother Caspar, the monastery's master mason, bears the weight of knowing that every crack in the walls, every loose stone, every gap in the mortar could mean the difference between life and death for his brothers. At 51 years of age, he is ancient by medieval standards, yet his hands remain steady, and his knowledge of stone and lime mortar is encyclopedic. During his 30 years at St. Erasmus, Caspar has developed an almost supernatural ability to hear trouble in the walls, the subtle shifts and groans that warn of structural weakness, the whisper of wind through gaps that will become roaring gales once winter truly arrives. His calloused fingers can detect temperature variations in stone that indicate dangerous thermal stress, and he knows every inch of the monastery's construction, like a lover knows their beloved's face. But Caspar carries a terrible secret that weighs on him more heavily than any stone block. 3 winters ago, during the catastrophic season that claimed 14 brothers, he made a decision that still haunts his dreams. When the north wall of the dormitory began to crack under the pressure of expanding ice, threatening to collapse and kill everyone sleeping within, Caspar chose to reinforce it, using stones cannibalized from the monastery's outer defensive wall. His engineering saved lives that winter, but it left the monastery permanently vulnerable to attacks from bandits or wolves. Every night since then, he has lain awake wondering if his choice to save his brothers from the cold has doomed them all to a different kind of death. In the monastery's workshop, Brother Quintus tends to tools and equipment with the devotion other monks reserve for prayer. As the community's master craftsman, he is responsible for maintaining everything from cooking implements to farming tools, from the mechanisms that operate their few machines to the delicate instruments used in the scriptorium. Quintus possesses an almost mystical understanding of metal, wood, and leather. He can coax functionality from broken implements using nothing but ingenuity and scraps of material that others would discard as worthless. His workshop is a marvel of medieval engineering, filled with devices of his own invention designed to make their hard lives marginally more bearable. But Quintus faces a challenge that grows more impossible each year: the gradual depletion of raw materials. Every repair he makes requires sacrificing something else. Every tool he creates depletes their precious reserves of iron and wood. He has become a master of what we might call survival mathematics, constantly calculating whether fixing one essential item is worth the materials it will consume, knowing that those same materials might be needed for something even more critical later in the winter. His greatest fear is not death itself, but the moment when his accumulated knowledge and skill will prove insufficient to keep his brothers alive. The monastery's youngest member, Brother Damien, barely 18 years old, represents both hope and vulnerability in equal measure. Raised as an oblate since childhood, he knows no life beyond these walls, yet his youth gives him advantages that his older brothers lack. His body recovers more quickly from cold and hunger, his reflexes remain sharp in dangerous conditions, and his optimism has not yet been ground down by repeated encounters with winter's brutality. Damien serves as messenger and scout for the community, his small size and agility allowing him to navigate conditions that would kill larger, older men. Yet Damien's inexperience makes him dangerous to both himself and others. He lacks the instinctive caution that keeps veterans alive, and his eagerness to prove himself often leads him to volunteer for tasks beyond his capabilities. The older monks watch him with a mixture of protective affection and constant anxiety, knowing that his survival depends on learning harsh lessons before they kill him. Brother Matthias has privately decided that keeping Damien alive through his first truly terrible winter is more important than any other goal, even if it means sacrificing resources that could save multiple older brothers. Among the most enigmatic figures in our winter drama is Brother Severus, the monastery's herbalist and keeper of what they euphemistically call natural philosophy. A learned man who joined the community after what he describes only as troubles in the outside world, Severus possesses knowledge that seems almost magical to his fellow monks. He can identify edible plants that others would dismiss as weeds, prepare medicines from bark and roots that actually work, and most mysteriously, predict weather patterns with an accuracy that borders on prophecy. His cell contains the monastery's most carefully guarded secrets: jars of preserved compounds, dried preparations that can mean the difference between survival and death, and written formulas that he guards more jealously than the scriptorium protects its illuminated gospels. but Severus carries darkness within him that occasionally surfaces in unguarded moments. He speaks rarely of his life before taking vows, yet brothers have noticed scars on his hands that suggest familiarity with violence, and his knowledge of human anatomy seems suspiciously practical for a man of purely scholarly pursuits. Some whisper that his troubles in the outside world involved accusations of practicing forbidden arts, and that his remarkable abilities with plants and potions come from sources the Church would consider heretical. Whether these suspicions are true or merely the product of fear and superstition, Severus remains an essential member of their community, his skills too valuable to question too closely. The monastery's abbot, Father Aldrich, governs this collection of desperate men with a combination of spiritual authority and pragmatic wisdom that reflects decades of making impossible decisions. At 62, he is the oldest person in the community, a walking miracle of survival, who has guided St. Erasmus through winters that destroyed other monasteries entirely. His leadership style during the deadly months combines the compassion of a pastor with the cold calculation of a military commander, because he understands that sentiment and favouritism are luxuries that can kill everyone under his care. Father Aldrich maintains detailed records of every previous winter, studying patterns of survival and death with the intensity of a scholar examining scripture. He knows which brothers are most likely to survive severe cold based on their body types and previous performance. He understands the psychology of communal survival, recognizing when despair threatens to destroy morale and when individual selfishness might fracture the cooperation that keeps them all alive. Most importantly, he has learned to make the terrible calculations that leadership requires, deciding how much food each brother receives based not on fairness or need, but on their likelihood of survival and their value to the community's continued existence. These are the men who will face the coming winter together, not as abstract historical figures, but as human beings with all the complexity, courage, and frailty that humanity entails. Their individual stories will interweave throughout the dark months ahead, creating a tapestry of survival that reveals both the best and worst of human nature when pushed to its absolute limits. Among all the remarkable figures who called St. Erasmus home, none embodied the contradictions and complexities of medieval monastic life quite like Brother Godwin the chronicler. His story, which unfolds like a sermon written in blood and ice, reveals how even the most learned and devout men could be transformed by the brutal necessities of winter survival into something their younger selves would barely recognize. Godwin had arrived at the monastery 15 years earlier as a man of 32, fleeing what he described only as the corruptions of court life in the service of Lord Reginald of Thornwick. Those who knew him in those early days remembered a scholar of exceptional learning, fluent in Latin, Greek and Arabic, with a personal library that included works by Augustine, Aristotle, and even forbidden texts by Islamic philosophers that had somehow found their way into Christian lands. His calligraphy was so exquisite that visiting bishops would request examples of his work, and his theological debates could hold audiences spellbound for hours as he wove together complex arguments with the skill of a master craftsman. But the learned man who had entered St. Erasmus bore little resemblance to the figure Brother Godwin would become. The transformation began during his third winter at the monastery, during the terrible season of 1191 that the surviving brothers still spoke of in whispers. That year, an early blizzard had trapped the community with less than half their usual provisions, and by February they were facing starvation so severe that even the most devout brothers began to question whether God had abandoned them entirely. It was during this crisis that Godwin first demonstrated the practical intelligence that would make him indispensable to the community's survival. While other brothers prayed for divine intervention, or despaired over their fate, Godwin methodically analysed their situation with the same scholarly precision he brought to theological questions. He calculated their remaining food supplies down to individual portions, mapped out rationing schedules that would maximise their chances of survival, and most crucially, identified alternative sources of nutrition that other monks had overlooked or dismissed as unsuitable for human consumption. The transformation was as shocking as it was necessary. This man, who had once spent entire days contemplating the finer points of scriptural interpretation, now devoted his considerable intellect to determining which types of tree bark could be ground into flour, how to extract maximum nutrition from animal bones by boiling them repeatedly, and which insects and grubs could supplement their meagre diet without causing illness. His theological library gradually gave way to practical texts, herbals, treatises on agriculture, and even works on what we might now call survival medicine. More dramatically still, Godwin began to display an almost supernatural ability to predict and prepare for winter's worst challenges. He developed an intricate system for monitoring weather patterns, tracking subtle changes in wind direction, cloud formation, and animal behavior that allowed him to forecast storms days in advance. This knowledge proved invaluable for planning crucial activities like gathering firewood, securing the monastery's vulnerable areas, and rationing food supplies to coincide with periods when hunting or foraging might become possible. But perhaps Godwin's most controversial innovation was his systematic approach to what he called survival triage, the coldly rational process of determining which brothers were most likely to survive severe conditions and allocating resources accordingly. Drawing on his theological training, Godwin argued that God expected them to be good stewards of the resources they had been given, which meant making mathematical decisions about who would receive additional food, warmer clothing, or access to the monastery's limited sources of heat. These decisions required a kind of moral calculus that would have been unthinkable to the scholar who had first taken vows at St. Erasmus. Godwin developed detailed profiles of each brother, tracking their medical history, their body mass and strength, their psychological resilience, and their practical skills. When resources became critically scarce, he would present Father Aldrich with recommendations that read like military dispatches. Brother Marcus should receive extra rations because his carpentry skills were essential for maintaining the monastery's defences. Brother Thomas should be given priority access to the warming fires because his role as cook made his survival crucial to everyone else. Brother Peter, despite his obvious suffering, should receive minimal support because his chronic weakness made his death statistically inevitable, and resources spent on him were resources taken from men who might actually survive. The psychological toll of making such decisions was evident in the changes that overtook Godwin's personality during the winter months. The eloquent scholar who delighted in theological discourse became increasingly taciturn and withdrawn as the cold deepened. He would spend hours alone in his cell, surrounded by charts and calculations that looked more like the work of a military strategist than a man of God. Some brothers whispered that the burden of choosing who lived and who died had driven him to the edge of madness, while others argued that his rational approach to survival was the only thing standing between the community and complete annihilation. The crisis that would define Godwin's legacy came during the winter of 1198, when a combination of early storms and spoiled grain left the monastery facing its worst supply shortage in living memory. By January, they were down to quarter rations, and brothers were beginning to die from a combination of starvation and cold. It was then that Godwin made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He secretly began supplementing his own diet with food stolen from the communal stores, justifying his actions with the argument that his survival was essential to the community's continued existence. When his theft was discovered by Brother Felix during a routine inventory, Godwin was faced with a choice that would have destroyed a lesser man. He could confess his crime and face expulsion from the monastery, which would mean certain death in the winter wilderness, or he could use his considerable rhetorical skills to justify his actions and maintain his position. What followed was perhaps the most brilliant and morally complex argument ever presented within the walls of St. Erasmus, as Godwin systematically demonstrated that his individual survival was worth more to the community than the food he had consumed. Speaking before the assembled brothers with the same passion he had once brought to theological debates, Godwin argued that leaders in desperate situations had not just the right, but the obligation to preserve themselves for the greater good. He cited biblical precedents, philosophical arguments, and practical examples to support his position, ultimately convincing even his accusers that his actions, while technically theft, were morally justified by the circumstances they faced. But the cost of this moral victory was profound. From that moment forward, Godwin became a figure of both respect and suspicion within the community. His brothers relied on his expertise and leadership, yet they could never again trust him completely. He had crossed a line that separated the faithful from the pragmatic, and while his crossing had probably saved lives, it had also revealed the terrible transformations that winter could work upon even the most devoted souls. In the years that followed, Brother Godwin continued to serve as the monastery's survival expert. his knowledge and planning helping St. Erasmus weather storms that destroyed other communities. But he was a changed man, marked by the knowledge of what he was capable of when survival was at stake. His story serves as a window into the moral complexities that winter imposed upon these communities of faith, revealing how the struggle to stay alive could transform even the most scholarly and devout men into something harder, more calculating, and perhaps more human than the ideals they had originally embraced. The daily realities of surviving winter at St. Erasmus were governed by a systematic brutality that touched every aspect of monastic life, transforming what should have been a house of prayer into something resembling a military campaign against death itself. By examining the methodical ways these monks fought for survival, we begin to understand how human beings can endure conditions that seem designed to extinguish life entirely. The monastery's heating system, such as it was, represented one of the most critical battlegrounds in their war against winter. The central heating consisted of 3 massive stone fireplaces located in the chapel, the refectory, and the abbot's quarters, along with a handful of smaller braziers that could be moved between rooms as needed. But these meagre heat sources were utterly inadequate for warming a complex of buildings designed to house nearly 40 men through months of sub-freezing temperatures. The mathematics of fuel consumption were particularly merciless. Each major fireplace required approximately 60 pounds of wood per day to maintain even minimal heat output, meaning the monastery needed nearly 2 tons of fuel weekly just to keep their primary heating sources operational. Given that their entire winter fuel supply rarely exceeded 50 tons of seasoned wood, this created an impossible equation that forced the monks to develop increasingly desperate heating strategies. Brother Quintus had devised an ingenious but dangerous system of portable heating that involved moving red-hot stones from the main fireplaces to other areas of the monastery. Using specially designed iron tongs and wheeled carts, teams of monks would transport these thermal masses while they still radiated heat, placing them in strategic locations throughout the complex. This process was extraordinarily hazardous. Burns from handling the stones were common, and several brothers had been permanently injured when carts overturned and scattered blazing rocks across corridor floors. Yet this primitive heat distribution system often meant the difference between survival and death in the monastery's more remote chambers. The food rationing system implemented at St. Erasmus during winter months revealed the coldest aspects of survival mathematics. Brother Matthias maintained detailed charts tracking every scrap of edible material in the monastery's stores, calculating daily allocations based not just on quantity, but on the complex interplay of nutritional value, spoilage rates, and individual survival probabilities. A typical winter day's ration for a healthy adult monk consisted of 4 ounces of bread made from a mixture of grain, ground acorns, and sawdust, 2 ounces of preserved meat or fish, a small portion of aged cheese, and a thin gruel made from whatever vegetables could be stretched to provide minimal nutrition. But these official rations represented only the beginning of the monastery's food crisis. The bread, when available, was often so hard that it required soaking in warm water for an hour before it could be chewed safely. The preserved meats were frequently rancid by midwinter, requiring careful inspection to remove portions that had spoiled beyond even their desperate standards of acceptability. Most devastatingly, the monastery's brewing operation typically failed completely once temperatures dropped below freezing, depriving the monks of their traditional source of calories from ale and forcing them to rely on melted snow for liquid intake. The psychological impact of chronic hunger manifested itself in ways that challenged every aspect of monastic discipline. Brothers who had spent years in contemplative prayer found their thoughts consumed by elaborate fantasies about food, describing imaginary feasts in detail during their few permitted conversations. The traditional periods of fasting that marked the liturgical calendar became meaningless exercises, since the monks were already existing at starvation levels throughout the winter months. Most disturbingly, the communal meals that had once provided opportunities for spiritual fellowship devolved into tense, silent affairs, where each brother watched his neighbours carefully, fearful that someone might be receiving larger portions or hoarding food for private consumption. The monastery's medical situation during winter presented challenges that would have overwhelmed even trained physicians, let alone Brother Honorius, with his limited knowledge of medieval healing practices. Hypothermia was a constant threat that manifested in stages, beginning with uncontrollable shivering and progressing through confusion, loss of coordination, and finally unconsciousness and death. The monastery had developed crude but effective methods for treating mild cases, including shared body heat, warm drinks prepared from precious fuel reserves, and gradual rewarming procedures that prevented the shock that could kill patients who were warmed too quickly. Frostbite presented an even more complex medical challenge, requiring decisions that tested both medical knowledge and moral courage. Brother Honorius had learned through bitter experience to recognize the signs of tissue death that indicated amputation was necessary to prevent gangrene from spreading and killing the patient. His surgical instruments, primitive iron implements heated in fire for sterilization, allowed him to perform these operations with a success rate that was remarkable for the era. Yet each amputation represented a permanent reduction in the monastery's collective ability to perform the physical labor necessary for survival, creating a cruel calculus where saving a man's life might doom the entire community. Respiratory diseases flourished in the monastery's cold, damp environment, spreading rapidly through a population weakened by malnutrition and stress. The wet coughs that developed into pneumonia killed more monks than any other single cause, and Brother Honorius had developed desperate but occasionally effective treatments involving steam inhalation, herbal preparations, and isolation procedures designed to prevent contagion. His infirmary became a grim triage center where he made daily decisions about which patients were likely to recover and deserved precious medical supplies, and which should be allowed to die with whatever comfort could be provided. The water supply situation at St. Erasmus during winter created yet another layer of survival complexity. The monastery's wells frequently froze solid, forcing the monks to melt snow and ice for all their liquid needs. This process required precious fuel and created significant health risks, since the monks had no understanding of bacterial contamination and often melted snow that had been polluted by animal waste or other contaminants. Dysentery and other intestinal diseases were common results, further weakening men already pushed to the limits of endurance by cold and hunger. Perhaps most challenging of all was the monastery's waste disposal system, which became a serious health hazard once winter weather made their normal sanitation procedures impossible. The communal latrines, located in a separate building connected to the main complex by covered walkways, became unusable when temperatures dropped low enough to freeze human waste solid. This forced the adoption of emergency procedures involving chamber pots and waste storage that created serious contamination risks in the cramped living quarters, where dozens of men were confined together for months at a time. These systematic challenges reveal the full scope of what medieval monks faced during winter months. Not romantic struggles against picturesque adversity, but a comprehensive assault on human survival that tested every aspect of their physical, mental, and spiritual resources. The miracle is not that some died, but that any managed to live through such conditions year after year, developing the knowledge and techniques that allowed their communities to endure in one of history's most unforgiving environments. While the popular imagination often focuses on the dramatic lives of abbots and learned brothers, the true backbone of winter survival at St. Erasmus rested on the shoulders of the monastery's most overlooked inhabitants, the lay brothers, servants, and oblates, whose stories rarely found their way into official chronicles, but whose labour and sacrifice made the difference between life and death for the entire community. Brother Osric represented one of these invisible figures, whose contribution far exceeded his humble status within the monastery's rigid hierarchy. A lay brother who had joined the community after losing his farm to debt and feudal obligations, Osric possessed practical knowledge that proved invaluable during the desperate winter months. Unlike the educated monks who had spent their lives in scholarly pursuits, Osric understood the harsh realities of peasant survival, how to stretch a handful of grain into meals for a week, how to extract nutrition from sources that others would dismiss as inedible, and most crucially, how to maintain hope when death seemed inevitable. Osric's background as a farmer had taught him to read the subtle signs that warned of particularly brutal winters. He could predict the severity of coming cold by observing the thickness of squirrel fur, the patterns of bird migration, and the depth at which earthworms burrowed into the soil. This knowledge allowed him to advocate for extra preparations that often proved crucial to survival, though his low status meant his warnings were frequently dismissed by the monastery's more educated leadership, until bitter experience proved his wisdom correct. The domestic staff who served the monastery faced challenges that were both more immediate and more invisible than those confronting the ordained brothers. Young William, a servant boy of perhaps 14 years who helped in the kitchens, carried responsibilities that would creche most modern adults. His daily routine during winter months began before dawn with the dangerous task of breaking ice on the water barrels, a job that frequently resulted in cuts from ice shards or frostbite from prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures. Throughout the day, he hauled firewood, carried buckets of melted snow for cooking and cleaning, and assisted with food preparation using implements so cold they could burn exposed skin on contact. William's position in the monastery's hierarchy meant he received smaller food rations than the ordained brothers, yet his physical labour during winter months actually required more calories for survival. This cruel mathematics forced him to develop ingenious methods of supplementing his diet, scavenging scraps from food preparation, eating parts of preserved foods that others discarded as inedible, and even consuming what modern nutritionists would recognize as surprisingly effective survival foods like boiled leather and ground bone meal. His knowledge of these desperate nutrition sources would prove crucial during the worst supply shortages, when his ability to extract sustenance from seemingly worthless materials helped keep the entire community alive. The monastery's seamstress, Sister Agatha, occupied a unique position as the only woman regularly present within the walls of St. Erasmus. As a widow who had taken informal vows and dedicated her life to serving the community, she possessed skills that were absolutely essential for winter survival, but were rarely acknowledged in the monastery's official records. Her ability to repair and modify clothing, bedding, and other textile goods meant the difference between adequate protection from cold and exposure that could kill within hours. Sister Agatha's workshop, located in a small chamber near the kitchens, became a crucial centre of winter survival innovation. Working with whatever material she could obtain, scraps of worn-out robes, pieces of discarded leather, even animal pelts from the monastery's meagre hunting efforts, she created layered clothing systems that provided insulation far superior to the simple woolen robes that were standard monastic garb. Her technique of stuffing dried grass and moss between layers of fabric created primitive but effective insulation that could mean the difference between survival and death during the coldest nights. But Sister Agatha's greatest contribution lay in her understanding of the psychological importance of maintaining dignity and comfort during the most desperate circumstances. She insisted on continuing to mend and clean clothing, even when such tasks seemed impossibly difficult, understanding that maintaining some semblance of normal life helped preserve the mental health that was crucial for community survival. Her ability to create small comforts, a better-fitting hood that provided crucial protection from wind, a patched blanket that offered a few degrees of additional warmth, provided psychological benefits that far exceeded their practical value. The monastery's blacksmith, Brother Edmund, faced unique challenges that combined technical expertise with survival necessity. His forge, essential for maintaining tools and creating implements needed for winter survival, required enormous amounts of fuel that competed directly with heating needs for the living spaces. The iron and steel tools that were crucial for gathering firewood, preparing food, and maintaining the monastery's defences became increasingly brittle in extreme cold, requiring constant repair and replacement when materials for such work were virtually unavailable. Edmund had developed innovative techniques for working metal in extremely cold conditions, including methods for keeping his forge operational even when the water used for quenching steel froze solid within minutes of being drawn from the well. His ability to repair broken tools using scrap metal and improvised techniques often determined whether crucial work could be completed before weather conditions made such tasks impossible. Perhaps more importantly, Edmund understood that maintaining the community's tools was ultimately more valuable than any individual's survival, leading him to continue working in his frigid forge even when the cold threatened his own life. The monastery's stablemaster, Brother Joachim, carried the responsibility for maintaining the community's single horse through winter conditions that regularly killed livestock throughout the region. This seemingly simple task actually represented one of the monastery's most complex survival challenges, since the horse was essential for transportation, for powering certain machinery, and as an emergency food source if survival required such desperate measures. Joachim had to balance the animal's nutritional needs against the monastery's own food shortages, while providing shelter and care that protected valuable livestock without diverting resources needed for human survival. The stories of these unsung figures reveal the true complexity of medieval monastery survival during winter months. While abbots and scholars received recognition for their spiritual leadership, It was the practical knowledge and tireless labour of servants, lay brothers, and support staff that actually kept these communities alive through the darkest and coldest months. Their innovations in clothing, food preparation, tool maintenance, and resource management represented some of the most sophisticated survival technologies of the medieval period, developed through desperate necessity and passed down through generations of winter survivors. These men and women faced not only the same physical challenges as their more prominent counterparts, but also the additional burden of lower social status that meant reduced access to food, warmth, and medical care during emergencies. Yet their contributions were often more immediately vital to community survival than the scholarly or administrative work that received greater recognition. Their stories remind us that the true heroes of medieval winter survival were often those whose names never appeared in official chronicles but whose knowledge and sacrifice made survival possible for everyone else. The romanticized image of monks as peaceful scholars, pursuing quiet contemplation, crumbles entirely when we examine the violent realities that winter imposed upon even the most devout religious communities. Far from the serene spiritual warriors of popular imagination, the brothers of St. Erasmus were forced to confront forms of brutality that would challenge the faith of saints and transform gentle men of God into something harder, more desperate, and infinitely more dangerous than their vows had ever prepared them to become. The transformation began with what Brother Godwin euphemistically termed resource acquisition expeditions, desperate forays beyond the monastery walls that bore little resemblance to peaceful scholarly pursuits. When food stores ran dangerously low, usually by late January or early February, groups of the strongest brothers would venture into the frozen wilderness on missions that combined elements of hunting, scavenging, and what could only be described as sanctified robbery. These expeditions were fraught with dangers that went far beyond the obvious threats of cold and starvation. Brother Damien's first experience with such an expedition during the winter of 1202 shattered forever his naive understanding of monastic life. Accompanying a team led by Brother Caspar, the young monk witnessed his peaceful mentors transformed into something resembling a military unit as they prepared for their dangerous mission. The brothers donned whatever armour they could improvise from monastery materials, leather aprons reinforced with metal strips, wooden shields covered in animal hide, and weapons that ranged from kitchen knives lashed to wooden handles to crude spears fashioned from farming implements. The psychological preparation for these expeditions was almost as brutal as the physical dangers they would face. Father Aldrich would conduct what amounted to military briefings, discussing potential targets for their acquisition activities with the cold calculation of a general planning a siege. Isolated farmsteads that might contain overlooked food stores, abandoned villages where useful materials might be scavenged, and even active settlements whose inhabitants might be convinced to share their resources through intimidation or force, all became legitimate objectives when the alternative was watching their own community starve to death. The moral complexities of these expeditions created tensions that threatened to tear the community apart from within. Brothers who had taken vows of poverty and non-violence found themselves planning raids on neighbouring settlements, justifying theft and potential violence through increasingly desperate theological arguments. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. Men who had once debated the finer points of Christian charity now discussed the most effective methods for taking food from families who were themselves facing starvation. Brother Severus proved particularly valuable during these expeditions, not for his scholarly knowledge but for his mysterious familiarity with what could only be called guerrilla warfare tactics. His ability to move silently through winter forests, to identify potential ambush sites, and to plan escape routes suggested military experience that he never discussed openly. Under his guidance, the monastery's acquisition teams developed sophisticated techniques for approaching potential targets, evaluating defences, and executing raids with minimal risk to themselves while maximising the resources they could obtain. The psychological toll of these activities was evident in the dramatic changes that overcame participating brothers during and after their expeditions. Men who returned from successful raids often displayed a disturbing combination of relief at having secured necessary resources and trauma from the violence they had witnessed or participated in. Some brothers reported nightmares about the faces of families they had robbed, while others seemed to develop an addiction to the adrenaline and sense of power that came with successful raids. Father Aldrich found himself dealing with confessions that would have been unthinkable during peacetime, admissions of theft, violence, and even murder committed in the name of community survival. Perhaps most disturbing were the expeditions that targeted other religious communities. When intelligence reached St. Erasmus about monasteries that had been abandoned or were poorly defended, raiding parties would sometimes strike against their fellow Christians with the same ruthless efficiency they brought to attacks on secular targets. Brother Godwin maintained detailed records of these operations, documenting with scholarly precision the resources obtained from the ransacked priory of St. Columba, the looted supplies taken from the Abbey of Holy Cross, and the food stores seized from the hermitage of Brother Francis the Anchorite. These attacks against other religious houses created profound theological crises that challenged the very foundations of Christian brotherhood. How could men who had dedicated their lives to serving God justify robbing and potentially murdering other servants of the same divine master? The answer, developed through increasingly tortured reasoning, involved complex arguments about divine providence, the greater good, and the idea that God himself was testing their resolve by placing these tempting targets within their reach during desperate times. The physical violence that accompanied these expeditions often exceeded what was necessary for simple resource acquisition, suggesting that the brutality of winter survival had awakened something darker in the hearts of these supposedly holy men. Brothers returned with accounts of savage beatings administered to villagers who resisted their demands, of homes burned to prevent their occupants from surviving to seek revenge, and of killings that seemed motivated more by rage and desperation than by practical necessity. Brother Casper's leadership during these expeditions revealed aspects of his personality that seemed utterly incompatible with his peaceful demeanour during normal monastery life. Witnesses described him as becoming almost demonic during raids, his usual careful consideration replaced by cold brutality that terrified both enemies and allies alike. His knowledge of structural engineering proved valuable, not just for defensive purposes, but for planning attacks. He could identify the weakest points in buildings, the best locations for setting fires, and the most effective methods for breaking down doors and walls. The weapons training that became standard practice at St. Erasmus during winter months transformed the monastery's daily routine into something resembling a military camp. Brothers practiced combat techniques in the courtyard, learning to fight with agricultural tools adapted for warfare, developing coordinated attack strategies, and drilling escape and evasion procedures. The sound of wooden practice swords clashing together replaced the gentle murmur of scholarly discussion, while tactical planning sessions took precedence over theological debates. The aftermath of successful raids created additional moral complications as the community struggled to integrate stolen resources into their survival strategies. Food taken from other families had to be rationed and consumed while brothers tried to ignore the knowledge of whose mouths it had been taken from. Clothing and materials stripped from other communities had to be modified and distributed, while their new owners tried not to think about the original wearers who might be freezing to death in the wilderness. These violent expeditions reveal the true cost of winter survival for medieval religious communities, not just the physical price paid in cold and hunger, but the spiritual price extracted from men who found their deepest beliefs tested against the most basic needs of human survival. The gentle scholars and devoted servants of God were forced to become raiders, thieves, and killers, transforming their communities from centres of learning and prayer into armed camps where survival took precedence over every other consideration, including the very religious principles that had originally brought them together. The spiritual crisis that engulfed St. Erasmus during the devastating winter of 1204 would prove to be far more transformative than any physical hardship the community had previously endured. It began with what seemed like divine intervention, the arrival of Father Benedictus, a charismatic reformer who claimed to carry revolutionary teachings that would fundamentally alter how Christian communities should approach survival, sacrifice, and salvation itself. Father Benedictus appeared at the monastery gates during the first week of December, emerging from a blizzard like some biblical apparition, accompanied by 3 younger monks who regarded him with the fervent devotion typically reserved for living saints. Unlike the practical, earthbound brothers of St. Erasmus, these newcomers radiated an otherworldly intensity that immediately created tension within the established community. Benedictus himself was a tall, gaunt figure whose piercing eyes and melodious voice gave weight to his claims of having received direct revelations about God's true intentions for his faithful servants during times of extreme trial. The theological revolution that Benedictus proposed challenged every assumption about survival and sacrifice that had governed St. Erasmus for generations. According to his teaching, the desperate measures the monastery had adopted, rationing food, conducting raids, making calculated decisions about who would live and die, represented fundamental failures of faith that actually distanced the community from divine grace rather than ensuring their survival. True Christians, he argued, should embrace complete dependence on divine providence, abandoning all practical survival measures in favour of prayer, fasting, and absolute trust that God would provide for his faithful servants regardless of circumstances. Brother Godwin found himself at the centre of the theological storm that followed Benedictus's arrival. As the monastery's expert on survival mathematics and resource allocation, Godwin represented everything that the reformer condemned about the community's approach to winter hardship. The detailed charts and calculations that had helped St. Erasmus survive previous winters were dismissed by Benedictus as evidence of insufficient faith, while the rational triage systems that had saved countless lives were condemned as playing God, with decisions that should be left to divine will alone. The philosophical conflict between Benedictus and the established monastery leadership quickly divided the community into opposing factions that threatened to destroy St. Erasmus from within. Roughly half the brothers, led by some of the younger and more idealistic members, embraced Benedictus's teachings with the enthusiasm of converts discovering absolute truth. They abandoned their practical survival duties, spending their time instead in marathon prayer sessions and elaborate fasting rituals that Benedictus claimed would demonstrate their complete faith in divine providence. The other half of the community, primarily the older brothers whose experience had taught them the harsh realities of winter survival, regarded Benedictus as a dangerous fanatic whose teachings would lead to the community's complete destruction. Brother Caspar, whose engineering knowledge had kept the monastery's walls intact through countless brutal winters, found his expertise dismissed as evidence of spiritual weakness. Sister Agatha's careful conservation of clothing and materials was condemned as hoarding that demonstrated lack of trust in God's provision. Father Aldrich faced an impossible leadership challenge as he watched his carefully maintained community fracture along ideological lines that made practical cooperation increasingly difficult. The brothers who followed Benedictus refused to participate in food rationing, claiming that such measures interfered with God's will, while simultaneously expecting to receive their share of the resources that others had worked to gather and preserve. The reformers' followers abandoned their assigned duties in the workshops, kitchens, and maintenance areas, leaving crucial winter survival tasks to be performed by an increasingly exhausted and resentful core of practical-minded brothers. The crisis reached its breaking point during the Feast of the Epiphany, when Benedictus announced that God had revealed to him the ultimate test of the community's faith. According to his vision, the brothers should abandon all their stored food and fuel, open the monastery gates to the winter wilderness, and spend the remainder of the cold season in continuous prayer and fasting, trusting completely in divine intervention to sustain them until spring. Those who truly believed, he proclaimed, would be sustained by miraculous provision, while those who doubted would perish as a demonstration of the consequences of insufficient faith. The theological implications of this proposal created debates that raged through the monastery for days, dividing not just the community, but individual brothers who found themselves torn between practical experience and spiritual aspiration. Brother Severus, whose mysterious knowledge had contributed so much to the community's survival, struggled with the possibility that his entire approach to winter hardship might indeed represent a failure of faith rather than wise stewardship of God-given abilities. Even Brother Damien, whose youth and natural optimism had sustained him through previous trials, found himself questioning whether his desire to survive demonstrated spiritual weakness rather than healthy instinct. The resolution of this crisis came through a series of events that would be remembered at St. Erasmus for generations to come. On the night of January 15th, the temperature dropped to levels that hadn't been recorded in living memory, creating conditions so severe that survival became impossible for anyone not protected by the monastery's accumulated practical preparations. Benedictus himself, despite his proclaimed faith in divine provision, was found the next morning huddled near one of the fires that his followers had supposedly rejected, suffering from hypothermia severe enough to require the medical attention he had previously condemned as evidence of spiritual weakness. More dramatically, two of Benedictus's most devoted followers died during that terrible night, their bodies discovered frozen in the chapel, where they had insisted on maintaining their vigil without any protection from the cold. Their deaths, which Benedictus attempted to portray as martyrdom and evidence of their immediate ascension to paradise, instead served to demonstrate the practical consequences of abandoning survival measures in favour of purely spiritual solutions to physical problems. The theological aftermath of these deaths created a synthesis that would define St. Erasmus's approach to survival for years to come. Father Aldrich, drawing on decades of leadership experience, articulated a middle path that honoured both practical necessity and spiritual conviction. According to this new understanding, the survival techniques developed by the community represented not failures of faith, but rather faithful stewardship of the intelligence and abilities God had given them. Their duty was to use every practical means available to preserve the lives entrusted to their care, while maintaining their spiritual focus on the divine purpose that made survival worthwhile. This theological evolution transformed how the monks understood their winter struggles, reframing their survival efforts not as compromises with spiritual ideals but as active participation in divine providence. The calculations and rationing systems that had once seemed coldly practical were now understood as forms of prayer expressed through action. The dangerous expeditions and difficult decisions that had challenged their consciences were reinterpreted as tests of their willingness to make difficult choices in service of their community's survival and continued ministry. Brother Benedictus departed St. Erasmus as suddenly as he had arrived, taking with him the few remaining followers who still accepted his teachings about complete dependence on miraculous intervention. His brief presence had challenged every assumption about faith and survival that the community had developed, ultimately strengthening their understanding of how spiritual conviction and practical wisdom could work together rather than in opposition to each other during the most desperate circumstances. In the deepest heart of winter, when the philosophical debates had ended and the theological crises had been resolved, the monks of St. Erasmus faced the grinding reality of daily existence that consumed every moment of their waking lives. This was survival stripped of all romance and reduced to its most basic elements. The endless repetition of small tasks that meant the difference between seeing another sunrise and joining the frozen corpses that accumulated in the monastery's makeshift morgue. The daily routine that governed life during the worst months bore no resemblance to the ordered prayer schedule that structured monastery life during milder seasons. Instead of the traditional 8 canonical hours marked by bells and communal worship, the brothers' days were divided into survival periods determined by the practical necessities of staying alive in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The day began not with lauds at sunrise, but with what Brother Matthias grimly termed the morning inventory, a careful assessment of who had survived the night and what resources remained available for another day's struggle. This morbid ritual required checking each cell to determine which brothers had died during the night, a task that fell to whoever possessed sufficient strength to move through the monastery's frozen corridors. The bodies of those who had succumbed to cold, disease, or simple exhaustion during the dark hours had to be removed quickly, not out of disrespect for the dead, but because decomposition even in freezing temperatures could create health hazards for the living. Brother Honorius had developed a systematic approach to this daily triage that revealed the extent to which survival had replaced traditional religious concerns. Each surviving brother was evaluated for signs of hypothermia, frostbite, malnutrition, and disease, with those showing symptoms of potentially fatal conditions receiving priority access to the monastery's limited medical resources. The sick and injured were categorized according to their likelihood of survival and their value to the community's continued existence, creating a hierarchy of care that would have been unthinkable during normal times, but had become essential for maximizing the number of brothers who might live until spring. The preparation and distribution of food during these desperate months required a level of precision that bordered on the obsessive. Every grain of wheat, every scrap of preserved meat, every fragment of aged cheese was weighed and recorded with the accuracy of a money changer handling precious coins. Brother Felix had developed cooking techniques that extracted maximum nutrition from minimal ingredients, creating meals that were more exercises in chemistry than cuisine. His daily bread, made from a mixture of grain flour, ground acorns, sawdust, and whatever organic matter could be safely consumed, provided just enough calories to prevent immediate starvation while stretching their limited supplies through the longest possible period. The monastery's water situation during the worst cold required constant attention and innovation that pushed medieval technology to its limits. When the wells froze solid, usually by mid-January, the brothers had to rely entirely on melted snow and ice for all their liquid needs. This process consumed precious fuel and required techniques that Brother Quintus had developed through bitter experience. The snow had to be selected carefully, avoiding areas contaminated by animal waste or human activity, then melted slowly to prevent the rapid temperature changes that could crack their limited supply of containers. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of daily survival was the complete breakdown of privacy and personal space that winter conditions imposed upon the community. The monastery's individual cells, already Spartan by modern standards, became uninhabitable once temperatures dropped below survivable levels. This forced the brothers to abandon their traditional solitary sleeping arrangements in favour of communal survival chambers where dozens of men huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat in arrangements that violated every norm of medieval religious life. These forced intimacies created tensions and conflicts that threatened the community's psychological stability as much as physical hardships threatened their bodily survival. Brothers who had maintained cordial but distant relationships for years suddenly found themselves pressed together in cramped spaces, sharing not just warmth, but the sounds, smells, and unavoidable physical contact of desperate human beings reduced to their most basic needs. Arguments over sleeping positions, disputes about personal hygiene, and conflicts over the distribution of shared blankets became sources of tension that could escalate into violence if not carefully managed. The monastery's sanitation situation during the depths of winter created health hazards that compounded every other survival challenge the community faced. The traditional latrines, located in separate buildings connected to the main complex by outdoor walkways, became unusable when temperatures made such journeys potentially fatal. This forced the adoption of chamber pot systems that created serious contamination risks in the confined spaces where the brothers lived, worked, and slept. Brother Honorius struggled to maintain even basic hygiene standards using techniques that would have seemed primitive to Roman engineers a millennium earlier, yet his efforts to prevent the spread of disease probably saved more lives than any other single factor during the worst winters. The psychological impact of these living conditions manifested in ways that challenged every aspect of traditional monastic discipline. Brothers who had spent years in quiet contemplation found their thoughts consumed by primitive obsessions with warmth, food, and basic bodily functions. The intellectual discussions that had once filled their evening hours were replaced by practical conversations about fuel conservation, food allocation, and survival techniques. Many reported that their dreams, when exhaustion finally allowed sleep, were filled not with spiritual visions but with fantasies about warm fires, full meals, and comfortable beds that seemed impossibly luxurious from their current perspective. The community's traditional schedule of work and prayer collapsed entirely under the pressure of survival necessities. Every available moment had to be devoted to tasks that directly contributed to staying alive: gathering fuel, preparing food, maintaining shelter, caring for the sick, and performing the countless small maintenance tasks that prevented their deteriorating situation from becoming completely hopeless. The beautiful illuminated manuscripts that had been the pride of their scriptorium lay abandoned as Brother Anselm devoted his scholarly skills to calculating caloric requirements and tracking resource consumption with the precision he had once brought to copying sacred texts. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the gradual abandonment of the small comforts and dignities that had made their harsh life bearable during better times. Personal possessions that had provided psychological comfort were burned for fuel when nothing else remained. Books that had been treasured for their spiritual value were torn apart to provide paper for practical purposes when other materials were unavailable. Even the beautiful wooden crosses that marked each brother's cell were eventually consumed as fuel, leaving the monks surrounded by reminders of how completely their spiritual ideals had been subordinated to the basic animal need to survive another day. Yet somehow, in the midst of this systematic degradation of everything that had once made their lives meaningful, the brothers of St. Erasmus continued to endure. Their survival was not heroic or inspiring in any conventional sense. It was simply the stubborn persistence of human beings who refused to surrender to circumstances that seemed designed to extinguish every trace of civilized existence. Day after day, they performed the small, unglamorous tasks that kept them alive, finding meaning not in grand gestures or spiritual insights, but in the simple fact of continued existence itself. As we step back from the frozen corridors and desperate struggles of St. Erasmus Monastery, we begin to see that the story of these medieval monks transcends the specific details of their winter survival to reveal profound truths about the human condition that resonate across the centuries. Their experiences, while separated from us by nearly a millennium, illuminate aspects of human nature that remain constant despite all the technological and social changes that have transformed our world. The monks of St. Erasmus faced challenges that most of us can scarcely imagine, yet their responses to extreme adversity reveal patterns of adaptation and resilience that we recognize in ourselves and in every generation that has confronted seemingly impossible circumstances. Brother Godwin's transformation from scholarly theologian to survival strategist mirrors the way ordinary people throughout history have discovered hidden strengths and capabilities when faced with life-threatening situations. His willingness to abandon academic pursuits in favour of practical knowledge reflects a universal human capacity to prioritise survival over ideology when the stakes become absolute. The moral compromises that these holy men were forced to make, stealing from neighbouring communities, rationing resources based on cold calculations of survival probability, abandoning sick brothers who consumed precious resources without contributing to the community's welfare, reveal the ethical complexities that emerge whenever human beings are pushed to the limits of endurance. These were not evil men who chose cruelty over compassion, but rather ordinary individuals trapped in circumstances where every choice involved some form of moral compromise and where traditional ethical frameworks provided little guidance for unprecedented situations. Their story speaks to questions that remain painfully relevant in our own era. How do we maintain our humanity when circumstances seem designed to strip away everything that makes us civilized? What obligations do we have to care for the weak and vulnerable when our own survival is at stake? How do we balance individual needs against collective welfare when resources are insufficient for everyone? The monks of St. Erasmus grappled with these dilemmas without the benefit of modern ethical frameworks or philosophical systems, yet their struggles illuminate the same fundamental tensions between competing moral claims that we continue to face today. The gradual erosion of privacy, dignity, and personal autonomy that winter imposed upon the monastery community offers insights into how extreme circumstances can reshape social structures and human relationships. The breakdown of individual cells in favour of communal survival chambers parallels the way crisis situations throughout history have forced people to abandon customary boundaries and form new types of social bonds based on mutual dependence rather than personal choice. The tensions and conflicts that arose from these forced intimacies reveal how stress and deprivation can strain even the strongest communities. While the fact that most of these men managed to maintain some form of cooperative relationship demonstrates the remarkable human capacity for adaptation and compromise under pressure, the theological crisis precipitated by Father Benedictus's arrival speaks to timeless questions about the relationship between faith and practical action, between spiritual ideals and material necessities. His insistence that true believers should rely entirely on divine providence without taking practical steps to ensure survival represents an extreme position that most religious traditions have ultimately rejected. Yet his challenge forced the community to articulate a more sophisticated understanding of how spiritual conviction should guide practical decision-making. Their resolution that faithful stewardship of God-given abilities requires using every practical means available to preserve life, while maintaining spiritual focus on divine purpose, offers a model for integrating idealistic beliefs with pragmatic necessities that remains relevant for anyone struggling to live according to high principles in an imperfect world. The remarkable innovations and survival techniques developed by the monks demonstrate the extraordinary creativity that human beings display when necessity demands solutions to seemingly impossible problems. Brother Quintus's heating systems, Sister Agatha's insulation techniques, Brother Severus's nutritional strategies, and countless other examples of medieval ingenuity remind us that our ancestors were not primitive or backward, but rather highly intelligent people working with limited resources to solve complex challenges. Their ability to extract maximum benefit from minimal materials, to adapt existing technologies for new purposes, and to develop entirely new approaches to survival problems offers inspiration for contemporary challenges involving resource scarcity and environmental adaptation. The psychological toll of prolonged survival stress, evident in the personality changes that overtook many brothers during the worst winters, illuminates the relationship between physical deprivation and mental health that researchers are still working to understand. The way hunger consumed the thoughts of men who had once devoted themselves to spiritual contemplation, the manner in which cold and discomfort made intellectual pursuits impossible, and the transformation of gentle scholars into hardened survivors all speak to the profound connections between physical and psychological well-being that modern medicine is only beginning to fully appreciate. Perhaps most significantly, the story of St. Erasmus reveals the extraordinary resilience of human communities when they are united by shared purpose and mutual dependence. Despite all the conflicts, moral compromises, and individual failures that mark their winter struggles, the core community persisted year after year, developing institutional knowledge and survival traditions that enabled them to endure conditions that destroyed other monasteries. Their ability to maintain some form of civilized existence in circumstances that might have reduced other groups to complete savagery demonstrates the power of shared values and collective identity to sustain human beings through the darkest periods of their existence. The monk's experience also illustrates how extreme circumstances can clarify what truly matters in human life by stripping away everything that is merely conventional or superficial. When faced with the prospect of death from cold and starvation, these men discovered that survival itself became a form of spiritual practice, that caring for one another became the highest expression of their religious values, and that the simple act of persisting through adversity constituted a profound affirmation of life's meaning and value. Their story reminds us that every previous generation has faced challenges that seemed insurmountable, circumstances that appeared to threaten the very survival of human civilization, yet somehow humanity has persisted and even flourished. The monks of St. Erasmus represent just one example of countless communities throughout history that have found ways to endure through disasters, wars, famines, and other catastrophes that tested the limits of human endurance. Their survival was not guaranteed or inevitable. Many similar communities did not persist through such challenges, yet their success demonstrates that even under the most adverse conditions, human ingenuity, cooperation, and determination can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. As we consider their legacy from the comfort of our heated homes and abundant food supplies, we might reflect on what their experience teaches us about our own capacity for resilience, adaptation, and mutual support when circumstances demand such qualities from us. As the gentle warmth of your bed surrounds you and the soft darkness of night begins to settle over your consciousness, let us take our final leave of the monks of St. Erasmus and the harsh world they inhabited with such remarkable courage and determination. Their story, while rooted in the specific challenges of medieval winter survival, carries forward through the centuries to touch our own lives in ways both profound and subtle, reminding us of truths about human nature that transcend the boundaries of time and circumstance. In the quiet moments before sleep claims you completely, consider how the struggles of Brother Godwin, Father Aldrich, Sister Agatha, and all their fellow survivors echo in the challenges we face in our own era. While we may not confront the literal threat of freezing to death in stone corridors or starving through months of isolation, we each encounter situations that test our resilience, demand difficult choices, and force us to discover strengths we never knew we possessed. The monk who learned to calculate survival rations with mathematical precision mirrors, the modern parent struggling to balance family needs against limited resources, the abbot making impossible decisions about who would receive precious medical attention, reflects the choices that healthcare workers, emergency responders, and community leaders face whenever demand exceeds supply. The psychological transformation that winter imposed upon these holy men offers insights that remain startlingly relevant for anyone who has experienced prolonged stress, adversity, or crisis. Their discovery that intellectual pursuits became impossible when basic survival was at stake speaks to the way trauma can reshape our priorities and mental processes. Their struggle to maintain dignity and spiritual focus while being reduced to the most primitive concerns for warmth and food illuminates the ongoing human challenge of preserving our highest values when circumstances seem designed to strip away everything that makes us civilized and humane. Perhaps most importantly, The story of St. Erasmus demonstrates that survival itself can become a form of meaning, that the simple act of persisting through difficulty constitutes a profound affirmation of life's value. These monks did not survive their brutal winters because they were saints or heroes in any conventional sense, but because they possessed the ordinary human capacity to endure one more day, to perform one more necessary task, to make one more difficult decision in service of something larger than their individual comfort or convenience. Their example suggests that heroism is not found in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the quiet determination to continue existing and caring for one another when existence itself requires extraordinary effort. As sleep begins to claim your consciousness, let the image of these remarkable men drift through your thoughts, not as distant historical figures, but as fellow human beings whose experiences illuminate our own capacity for endurance, adaptation, and mutual care. Their monastery walls may have crumbled centuries ago, their names may be forgotten by history, but the essential human qualities they displayed, resilience in the face of adversity, creativity under pressure, loyalty to community, and the determination to preserve life and meaning despite overwhelming challenges, continue to live within each of us. The winter that tested them so severely eventually yielded to spring, as winters always do, bringing renewed life, fresh possibilities, and the gradual healing of wounds, both physical and psychological. Their survival through the darkest months was not an end in itself, but a bridge to futures they could not have imagined during their desperate struggles. Similarly, the challenges we face in our own lives, however overwhelming they may seem, are not permanent states, but temporary seasons that will eventually give way to new opportunities for growth, renewal, and positive change. In your dreams tonight, you might find yourself walking through the corridors of an ancient monastery, feeling the weight of responsibility that comes with caring for others, experiencing the satisfaction of solving complex problems with limited resources, or discovering the profound bonds that form between people who have shared extreme challenges together. If such visions visit you, welcome them as reminders of your own capacity to endure, to adapt, and to find meaning in the struggle itself. The monks of St. Erasmus faced their trials without the comfort of knowing how their story would end, without the reassurance that spring would eventually return, without the certainty that their sacrifices would ultimately prove worthwhile. Yet they persisted anyway, choosing hope over despair, action over resignation, community over isolation. Their example suggests that we too can find the strength to face uncertainty with courage, to make difficult decisions with wisdom, and to support one another through whatever challenges await us in the seasons ahead. So rest well tonight, dear friend, surrounded by warmth and comfort that these brave monks could scarcely have imagined. Let their story remind you of the extraordinary resilience that lies dormant within ordinary human beings, waiting to be called forth when circumstances demand greatness from everyday lives. Let their memory inspire you to approach your own challenges with the same determination, creativity, and commitment to community that enabled them to survive when survival seemed impossible. As the final echoes of their story fade into the gentle darkness of approaching sleep, carry with you this simple truth. The human spirit that sustained those monks through their darkest hours is the same spirit that lives within you, ready to meet whatever winter may come with courage, wisdom, and the unshakable conviction that spring always follows, bringing with it new possibilities for life, growth, and hope. May your dreams be filled with the warmth they so desperately sought, and may you wake tomorrow with renewed appreciation for the simple miracles of comfort, security, and community that their sacrifices helped to make possible. Good night, fellow traveller through time, and thank you for joining me on this journey into the remarkable world of medieval winter survival. Sleep well, knowing that you carry within yourself the same capacity for endurance and transcendence that made their survival possible, and that their story continues to live on through everyone who learns from their example of courage in the face of impossible odds. As the first pale light of dawn creeps through your window and consciousness gently returns, perhaps you find yourself wondering what became of those remarkable souls whose winter struggles filled your dreams through the long night hours. The story of St. Erasmus Monastery did not end with that brutal season we witnessed together, but continued to unfold in ways that would have surprised even the most far-sighted of its inhabitants. The spring of 1205 arrived later than anyone could remember, with snow lingering well into what should have been the planting season, and ice remaining thick on the water barrels until nearly May. When the thaw finally came, it revealed a monastery transformed not just by the physical damage of winter's assault, but by the profound changes that extreme hardship had wrought upon the men who called it home. Of the 37 brothers who had entered that terrible season, only 23 emerged to see the return of green grass and flowing water. Brother Godwin, whose scholarly transformation into a survival strategist had proved so crucial to the community's endurance, found himself appointed as the monastery's new cellarer, formally recognizing the practical knowledge that had been forged in winter's crucible. His detailed records of survival techniques, resource management, and crisis leadership became the foundation for what would grow into one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated disaster preparedness systems. Monasteries from across the continent would eventually send representatives to study at St. Erasmus, learning the hard-won wisdom that could mean the difference between survival and extinction when nature unleashed its full fury. The innovations born of desperation gradually evolved into permanent improvements that made the monastery not just more survivable, but more prosperous than it had ever been before. Brother Quintus's heating systems, refined through successive seasons, attracted the attention of master builders who incorporated his techniques into castle and cathedral construction throughout the region. Sister Agatha's textile innovations spread through the surrounding villages, improving the winter survival prospects for countless families who had previously faced the cold with nothing but hope and prayer. Perhaps most remarkably, the theological synthesis that had emerged from Father Benedictus's challenge became the foundation for a new approach to religious life that balanced spiritual devotion with practical wisdom in ways that influenced monastic communities for generations to come. The Brothers of St. Erasmus became known not just as scholars and contemplatives, but as teachers of survival, as counselors for communities facing crisis, and as living examples of how faith could be expressed through competent action rather than passive acceptance of whatever circumstances might bring. Brother Damien, the young monk whose inexperience had made him such a liability during those desperate months, grew into one of the community's most effective leaders, his youthful optimism tempered by hard-earned knowledge but never entirely extinguished. The boy, who had once volunteered for dangerous tasks out of naive enthusiasm, became a man who could assess risks with scientific precision while maintaining the courage necessary to take calculated gambles when the stakes demanded bold action. The monastery's reputation for winter survival expertise brought unexpected prosperity, as noble families began sending their sons to be educated in an environment that promised to develop both spiritual depth and practical competence. The tuition fees from these students, combined with consulting payments from other religious houses seeking to improve their own survival prospects, provided resources that allowed St. Erasmus to expand its operations and influence far beyond what the original community could have imagined. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of that terrible winter lay not in practical innovations or institutional changes, but in the transformation of how the brothers understood their relationship to suffering, endurance, and the meaning of religious life itself. They had discovered that genuine spiritual practice sometimes required making choices that seemed to contradict traditional teachings, that true compassion might demand apparent cruelty, and that faith could be expressed as effectively through careful planning and skillful action as through prayer and contemplation. The chronicles that Brother Godwin continued to maintain throughout his long life became treasure troves of practical wisdom that guided subsequent generations through crises both similar and entirely unprecedented. His writings, which combined theological reflection with detailed technical instructions, inspired a new genre of religious literature that acknowledged the sacred dimensions of apparently mundane activities like food preservation, building maintenance, and community organization. As you begin your own day, moving through a world where survival is largely taken for granted and winter's threats are held at bay by technologies those medieval monks could never have imagined, perhaps you might pause to consider how their legacy continues to unfold in the countless small acts of preparation, cooperation, and mutual care that sustain our own communities through whatever challenges we face. Their story reminds us that every generation inherits both the accumulated wisdom and the ongoing responsibility of those who came before, that the comfortable certainties we enjoy today were purchased through the struggles and sacrifices of countless individuals whose names we will never know, but whose courage continues to shelter us from storms both literal and metaphorical. The monastery of St. Erasmus eventually flourished for another 3 centuries before finally succumbing not to winter's assault, but to the social and political changes that transformed medieval Europe into something recognizably modern. Yet the principles they discovered, that survival requires both individual resilience and collective cooperation, that genuine leadership emerges from service rather than authority, that innovation flourishes when necessity meets knowledge and determination, continue to guide communities facing challenges that would have been unimaginable to those medieval monks, yet require the same fundamental human qualities they exemplified. So as you move into whatever weather awaits outside your window today, carry with you some small measure of their hard-won wisdom, that every challenge contains within it the seeds of unexpected strength, that apparent disasters can become sources of innovation and growth, and that the human capacity for adaptation and mutual support remains our greatest resource for facing whatever uncertainties the future might hold. Their winter has ended, but their story continues in everyone who chooses courage over comfort, community over isolation, and hope over despair when circumstances test the limits of human endurance. May you find in their example the inspiration to meet your own challenges with similar determination, creativity, and faith in the ultimate resilience of the human spirit. Thank you for sharing this journey through the depths of medieval winter and the heights of human determination. Until we meet again in another story, another time, another exploration of the remarkable ways ordinary people become extraordinary when extraordinary times demand nothing less than everything they have to give. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.